59. I think I maxed out on adventure for a while, Keith said, as Elwyn flashed a red orb around his chest. Thick scratches covered his arms, and his chin had a gash almost as deep as the one over his eye. Now I know why you need a physician on standby, Foster. Are you really okay? Sophie asked, feeling a bit dizzy every time she looked at the red streaks on his skin. She hoped they didn't hurt as much as the deep cut across her right cheek. Grady and Adeline had rushed outside the second they'd heard Sylvanie's agonizing screeching. They'd helped Keith and Sophie pull themselves away from the thrashing, wounded horse, and they'd hailed Elwyn and sedated Sylvanie before she could hurt herself further. But Sophie and Keith had both insisted on being treated outside in case Sylvanie woke up. Sophie winced as she tried to shift to a more comfortable position on the grassy ground. The instructions Mr. Forkel had sent explicitly forbade elixirs, serums, or sedatives of any kind. All Elwyn had been able to do was clean her wounds, which he was not happy about. She wasn't a fan either. It would have been nice to at least use a numbing balm, but they couldn't chance it. I knew I should have gone with you, Sandor grumbled, slashing his sword at the air like he was slaying imaginary attackers. Grady nodded as he paced back and forth across the pasture, wearing a groove in the soft ground. Every few seconds, he pummeled them with more questions about what happened, most of which Sophie didn't know the answers to, or didn't want to answer. She didn't know if she'd teleported or how she'd done it if she had, but she didn't want anyone to know either way. Then she'd have to explain about her crazy alicorn-inspired DNA. And everyone would probably run screaming away from the girl who was part horse. Another secret, but some things she just couldn't share. I'm so glad you're okay, Grady said, crouching and wrapping his arms around her. The hug was gentle, but tight, too, like he never wanted to let go. Sophie didn't want him to. Thank you for trusting me, she told him. Thank you for coming back. She heard Adeline sniffle and glanced over to where she was busy tending to Sylvanie. When their eyes met, Adeline whispered, I love you. I love you too, Sophie whispered back. I haven't been able to reach your parents, Grady told Keith. I tried hailing your father, but he hasn't responded yet. Yeah, and it's not like you'd expect him to be waiting up all night for me to come home safe or anything. Sophie tried to think of something to say, but Grady changed the subject. I guess this means you were right about the Black Swan, Sophie. I need to let my suspicions go. You really do. She tightened her grip around him as she added, I asked them about Jolie. His back went rigid. You what? He let me ask one question, and I asked about Jolie. He said that was not what the message meant, and that they had nothing to do with the fire. Grady wobbled and leaned back to bury his face in his hands. When he looked up, tears had pooled in his eyes and his arms were shaking. So it wasn't my fault, he whispered. The question made Sophie's heart swell. Now he could let go of his anger and his guilt, all the burdens he'd been carrying and battling for so long. Now he could just be Grady again. Did he know anything about the fire, Grady asked, drying his eyes on his sleeve. Sophie frowned. It almost seemed like he'd never considered it a murder, because, he said, it explains many things. But when I asked him what that meant, he told me I'd already used up my question. Grady heaved a heavy sigh, and Sophie couldn't blame him. Then he strangled her with another hug. Thank you for asking, Sophie. I'm sure there were lots of other things you wanted to know. There were, she admitted, but that was the most important. And not just for Grady. She may be an anomaly and a freak and created for things she didn't understand. And her real father may or may not be some mysterious elf who kept abandoning her when she needed him most. But she wasn't made by murderers. She wasn't bad. Explain to me more about these attackers, Sandor interrupted. I would like to better understand my enemy. Sophie shivered as the 5 black-cloaked figures filled her mind. There were more of them this time, but I didn't recognize any of their voices. They had a patch on their sleeve, Keith added as Elwyn flashed more light around his face. A white circle with an eye in the center, like it was staring at you. Totally creepy. Can you project the symbol? Grady asked Sophie. She shook her head. I didn't see it. I wish I had. I'll try to draw it, Keith offered. I got a good look as I was aiming those Starblade things, and I sliced one of their shoulders pretty deep. Maybe it'll leave a scar we can recognize. Good boy, Sandor told him. Yeah, well, who knows what would have happened if the Black Swan hadn't show up with their dwarves. Things were getting pretty bleak. I wonder if they really would have taken us, though, Sophie mumbled almost to herself. I think they were after Sylvanie. She was the only one they shouted at each other about. It was like Keith and I were just grabbed by default. Grady turned pale as he processed that. We'd better warn the guards to be on high alert. Sandor nodded. I don't understand why they'd want her, Sophie admitted. Power. Grady went back to wearing a groove in the soil with his pacing. Sylvanie is the only one who can reset the timeline. Whoever controls her has the council at their mercy, to some extent, which means I'd better alert them immediately. He pulled out his imparter and moved far away enough that they couldn't listen to what he said, which was just as well. Sophie didn't want to hear how Bronte reacted when he found out Sylvanie had been injured. Is she going to be okay? She asked Edeline, as Edeline rubbed a thick black balm into the part of Sylvanie's wing where bits of bone poked through the skin. It's hard to tell. She'll definitely live, but she may never fly again. This is a pretty bad break. Sophie looked away as Edeline set the bone. The crunching sound made her stomach turn, but not as much as the idea of Sylvanie being grounded for the rest of life. She knew better than anyone how hard that would be for a flight-happy alicorn. Speaking of breaks, Elwyn interrupted. Congratulations, Keith. You've cracked 4 of your ribs. First time I've ever seen that around here. Keith gave a weak smile. I'm sure I'll be proud in a few days, but for now, the whole stabbing pain in my chest is killing the triumph. Elwyn handed him 4 tiny vials in all different colors. Drink those and you'll be back to causing trouble in a few hours. Wow, really? Keith poured them all into his mouth at once. That's almost too easy. He glanced guiltily at Sophie. You really can't take any? Not yet. She forced a smile, but he didn't look convinced. Neither did Elwyn, who stomped over to change her bandages. I still can't believe you willingly took Limbium. And not just a drop. An ounce. Sometimes I think you really do have a death wish, Sophie, and this. He lifted her hand and pressed gently on the needle's bruise. Is downright barbaric. I don't know what that Mr. Forkel gave you, but he should be ashamed of himself. Sophie wished she could agree, but the truth was, he had no choice. It was the only way to fix me. Did it fix you? Grady interrupted, rejoining them. I don't know. I felt something change during the reaction, but it's hard to say until I try to use my abilities. Which you won't be doing for 24 hours, and don't even think about arguing, Elwyn interrupted again. If I have to leave you bruised and broken with no pain medicine, then you're not doing anything else. And when your time limit is up, I'm treating all of your injuries and doing a thorough exam before you're allowed to test your abilities. Deal? I'll only agree if you do one thing, Sophie countered. Flash the light around my face like you did last time, when it went wrong. Elwyn looked leery, so she added, It's only light. I just need to know. He sighed and raised his hand. I'd better not regret doing this, he whispered as he clicked his fingers and a thin blue orb flashed around her face. Sophie held her breath, waiting for the pull and the pain, but nothing changed. Tears burned her eyes as she laughed and waved the light away. It didn't hurt. Even though she knew she shouldn't, she let hope swell and spread until she was filled with an almost giddy warmth that dulled her aches and pains and erased her fears and worries. If that part of the problem was fixed, then maybe everything was fixed. And if everything was fixed, then maybe she could fix a few other things that were broken. Can you take me to Everglen tomorrow? She asked, hardly able to believe that in less than a day she might be able to look into Alden's bright teal eyes and have him actually see her, smile at her, talk to her. That depends, a sharp voice barked behind her, and all the warm hope burst with an icy shiver. Bronte stood at the front of the other counselors, his arms folded across his chest and a cold glint in his gray eyes. You all may be exiled.